Welcome to our video on the Cold War, a decades-long struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that shaped the world as we know it today. In this video, we'll explore the causes, key events, and outcomes of this important period of history. The origins of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the end of World War II. During the war, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against Nazi Germany. However, tensions between the two nations began to emerge towards the end of the war as they had different visions for the post-war world. The United States championed democracy, free markets, and individual freedoms, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and the collective ownership of resources. The U.S. had a strong economy and a powerful military, while the Soviet Union had suffered significant losses during the war but had expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. After the war, the two nations found themselves at odds as they competed for global influence. The U.S. saw the spread of communism as a threat to its own security and sought to contain its expansion. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, saw the U.S. as a hostile power seeking to encircle and undermine its government. This tension eventually led to the start of the Cold War, a period of geopolitical rivalry, economic competition, and ideological conflict that lasted from the late 1940s to the early 1990s. The two superpowers engaged in a variety of proxy wars, espionage, and propaganda campaigns, but never directly engaged in armed conflict. The arms race. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a fierce competition to develop more powerful weapons, including nuclear weapons. This arms race began in the late 1940s and continued for decades, with each side trying to outdo the other in terms of military strength. The development of nuclear weapons was particularly important in this arms race, as both sides saw them as a way to deter the other from attacking. The United States was the first country to develop and use nuclear weapons, dropping atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The Soviet Union followed suit and successfully tested their first nuclear bomb in 1949. The arms race escalated over the years, with both sides developing more and more powerful weapons, such as missiles, aircraft, and submarines. Each side invested heavily in research and development in order to gain an edge in military strength. This led to a massive increase in military spending by both countries, which had significant economic and social consequences. The arms race led to a dangerous and tense situation, with both sides constantly on edge and preparing for the worst. The possibility of a nuclear war was a constant threat, and the world lived in fear of the devastating consequences that such a conflict could bring. The War in Korea. The conflict in Korean Peninsula was a significant event in the Cold War era. It began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The United States and its allies, including the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, intervened to support South Korea, while China and the Soviet Union provided support to North Korea. The war quickly escalated into a brutal conflict, with heavy casualties on both sides. The United States and its allies launched a series of offensives to push back against North Korean forces, but were met with fierce resistance. In response, Chinese troops entered the war on the side of North Korea, leading to a protracted conflict that lasted for 3 years. The war ended in a stalemate, with a demilitarized zone being established along the 38th parallel between North and South Korea. The conflict resulted in the deaths of millions of people and had a profound impact on the geopolitical landscape of the region. The Korean War also had wider implications for the Cold War. It marked a significant escalation in the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the two superpowers engaging in a proxy war in Korea. It also underscored the threat of nuclear war, as both sides came close to using nuclear weapons during the conflict. The legacy of the Korean War continues to shape the geopolitical landscape of the region to this day. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The October crisis in Cuba was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to nuclear war. The crisis began in October 1962 when U.S. intelligence discovered that the Soviet Union had installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is located just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. This presented a serious threat to national security, and President John F. Kennedy convened a group of advisors, known as the XCOM, to determine the best course of action. The United States imposed a naval quarantine on Cuba to prevent further Soviet missile shipments from reaching the island. This move prompted a tense standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, with both sides preparing for the worst. The U.S. military was put on high alert, and Soviet ships were seen moving towards the U.S. naval blockade. As tensions escalated, both sides engaged in secret negotiations to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Kennedy demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles from Cuba, while Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev demanded that the U.S. remove its missiles from Turkey. After several tense days, the two sides reached a compromise. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and to remove its missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a close call for nuclear war and highlighted the need for better communication and diplomacy between the two superpowers. It also had significant political consequences for both Kennedy and Khrushchev, as Kennedy emerged as a strong leader and Khrushchev faced criticism for his handling of the crisis. The crisis ultimately reinforced the importance of nuclear disarmament and diplomacy in preventing a catastrophic nuclear war. The end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was a significant event that reshaped the global order. The Soviet Union, which had been a superpower and a rival to the United States for decades, faced mounting economic and political challenges in the 1980s. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and introduced reforms aimed at revitalizing the economy and political system, known as perestroika and glasnost. However, these reforms proved too late, and by the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing an economic crisis and growing social unrest. In 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, and several Eastern European countries began to break away from Soviet influence, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1991, a failed coup against Gorbachev's government led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the republics that made up the Soviet Union declared their independence. The United States emerged as the sole superpower in the world, and the bipolar global system of the Cold War was replaced by a unipolar one. The impact of the Cold War in our days. The impact of this war can still be seen in many aspects of modern society, including politics, economics, and international relations. One of the most significant impacts of the Cold War is the continued presence of nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war. The arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union led to the development of increasingly powerful nuclear weapons, and many of these weapons are still stockpiled by both countries today. The ongoing tension between nuclear powers like the U.S., Russia, and North Korea is a legacy of the Cold War and a constant reminder of the danger of nuclear conflict. The Cold War also had a major impact on global politics and diplomacy. The rise of the U.S. as the sole superpower following the collapse of the Soviet Union has led to a shift in international power dynamics. The U.S. has become a dominant force in global affairs, often using its military and economic might to assert its influence around the world. The remnants of the Cold War can also be seen in ongoing conflicts in places like Syria and Ukraine. Economically, the Cold War led to the development of new technologies and industries, particularly in the areas of aerospace and defense. Many of the technologies developed during the Cold War have since been adapted for civilian use, leading to advances in fields like medicine and telecommunications. However, the focus on military spending during the Cold War also had a negative impact on the U.S. economy, contributing to a ballooning national debt that continues to be a major concern today. Finally, the Cold War had a lasting impact on popular culture, with many films, books, and other forms of media exploring themes of espionage, international conflict, and the dangers of nuclear war.